For as long as most of us can remember, the story has been the same. Cannabis makes you lazy, dulls your ambition, clouds your judgment. It's the punchline in comedies, the symbol of wasted potential. But what if that story was never true? What if it was the greatest lie of all? Across history, in cultures scattered across the globe, this plant was not mocked, it was honored. It wasn't a tool for sedation, but for awakening. Ancient texts, sacred rituals, hidden ceremonies all point to a truth that has been buried for centuries. Cannabis was seen as a bridge, a messenger, even a teacher. So why were we taught the opposite? Why was its sacred role erased, replaced with ridicule and fear? The answer lies not in the plant, but in the systems that feared what it could awaken inside of us. And tonight, we'll begin peeling back those layers to rediscover what was hidden Thoth's forgotten ritual, a practice meant not for escape, but for vision. If you've only ever thought of cannabis as haze and distraction, prepare to see it differently. The veil of misinformation is thin, and what lies beyond it may surprise you. This isn't a story about getting high. It's a story about remembering what was never meant to be forgotten. For most of us, the first time we ever heard the word weed, it was in the context of laziness, haze, or rebellion. The story was that it dulled ambition and clouded the mind. But if you peel back the layers of history, another picture emerges, one that is both surprising and illuminating. Across cultures and centuries, this same plant wasn't dismissed as a vice. It was revered as a teacher, a green messenger that stood at the threshold between the human and the divine. In the sacred texts of India, cannabis carried a name that reveals everything: Vijaya, the conqueror of suffering. It wasn't rolled casually into cigarettes, but mixed with milk and spices to create bhang, a drink meant to dissolve the ego and open the self to the cosmic dance of Shiva. When seekers lifted the cup, they weren't chasing a high, they were surrendering to an ancient path of transcendence, trusting the plant to soften the walls of identity so that something greater could pass through. Thousands of miles away, Egyptian priests burned the same herb in hidden temples. To them, cannabis wasn't entertainment. It was the green smoke that lingered beneath the eye of Horus, a ritual intended to ignite the third eye, the part of the mind said to see beyond appearances into the fabric of truth. The temples themselves were designed like instruments, their stone walls amplifying chants and resonating with incense. Within that atmosphere, the plant was not a distraction. It was an amplifier, magnifying silence, until silence itself became a doorway. Even the Bible hints at this forgotten lineage. In the book of Exodus, there is mention of cannabis, a mysterious ingredient scholars now believe refers to cannabis, mixed into the holy anointing oil. It was not symbolic fragrance, it was medicine, a sacrament. When prophets and priests were anointed, it wasn't about status, it was about transformation, an inner alignment with what they called divine will. What modern culture ridiculed as a vice was once part of the sacred toolkit of those chosen to guide entire nations. And so we find ourselves asking a different kind of question. If across continents and centuries, civilizations with no contact reached the same conclusion that this plant could serve as a bridge to higher awareness, what have we lost in reducing it to a joke? Perhaps the deeper mistake wasn't in calling it a drug, but in stripping away the reverence that gave it meaning. To use cannabis spiritually is to recover that sense of reverence. It isn't about how much you smoke or how potent the strain. It's about how you approach it, whether as a toy for distraction or as a tool for awakening. The ancients remind us that the difference is everything. In one hand, it clouds the mind. In the other, it clears the veil. That is why some called it a messenger, not because it whispered easy answers, but because it revealed what had been there all along. When we learn to approach it not as an escape, but as an invitation to look deeper, cannabis becomes something more than a plant. It becomes a guide, one that has been waiting for us to remember how to listen. If cannabis was once a sacrament, honored in temples, and whispered about in sacred texts, then why was it dragged into the shadows, mocked, criminalized, and turned into a symbol of laziness? The answer is not as simple as public health or social order. It cuts deeper, into the heart of how power operates. For centuries, institutions that claimed to be guardians of morality labeled cannabis as heresy. The church, in particular, had little room for a plant that allowed ordinary people to touch the divine without the mediation of priests or sacraments sold at the altar. If a herb could make profits out of peasants, what place would there be for hierarchy? Better, then, to brand it as sinful, to tuck its history into the margins, and to rewrite sacred oils as metaphor rather than practice. Governments soon followed suit, not because they feared the plant itself, but because they feared what awakened people might do with their freedom. A citizen who sees through illusion is harder to govern, harder to manipulate, harder to bend into the machinery of blind productivity. So cannabis was criminalized, painted as a threat to the order of society, when in truth it was a threat only to systems that profit from conformity. Corporations, too, found little use for a medicine that grows abundantly in the soil, asks no factory, and resists monopoly. A plant that could be cultivated by anyone in their backyard offered no path to endless profit, so it was demonized, replaced with patentable pills and profitable vices. The propaganda films of the 20th century, those wild-eyed warnings about madness and moral collapse, were never really about cannabis. They were about control. The so-called war on drugs was, at its core, a war on perception. It wasn't about keeping people safe. It was about keeping people asleep. Because if you keep the population sedated with substances that numb the mind, while outlawing the ones that awaken it, you maintain a society that questions little and obeys much. It is easier to sell, easier to govern, easier to distract. This is the hidden story behind prohibition. Cannabis wasn't banned because it made people lazy. It was banned because it made them aware. It reminded them of their sovereignty, of the veil that could be lifted, of the truths that don't serve empires or corporations. And so, the question lingers for us today. If the powers of the past tried so hard to bury this plant, what might it reveal if we dared to uncover it again? Perhaps the greatest danger of cannabis has never been what it does to the body, but what it awakens in the mind. A clear-eyed citizen is the last thing a system built on deception wants to see. Step into the shadowed halls of an Egyptian temple, and you can almost feel the air hum with secrets. The walls are carved with images of falcons, stars, and the all-seeing eye symbols that were never meant as mere decoration. These sanctuaries were designed as living instruments, places where sound, smoke, and silence merge to draw the human mind beyond the ordinary. At the heart of these rituals was a plant we now know well, though we have forgotten how it was once used. Cannabis. The priests of Egypt did not burn this herb alone. They mixed it carefully with blue lotus, frankincense, and myrrh, creating an incense that was more than fragrance. It was alchemy. As the smoke curled upward, it filled chambers that had been tuned for resonance, amplifying chants until the vibrations themselves became part of the ceremony. Under this cloud, seekers reported that carved glyphs seemed to move. Symbols revealed new meaning, and what had been stone suddenly became scripture. To them, these were not hallucinations. They were activations, the mind awakening to layers of reality that were always present, but hidden behind the veil of ordinary sight. At the center of these practices was the Eye of Horus, an ancient emblem etched across temple walls. The eye represented the third eye, the seat of inner vision. Priests believed cannabis, prepared and used in silence, was a key to opening that eye, not by creating fantasies, but by stripping away illusions. It was never about intoxication. It was about clarity, about the ability to see through appearances and glimpse the architecture of truth itself. To the Egyptians, the ritual mattered as much as the plant. The setting was sacred. The smoke was guided. The breath was steady. Every element was designed to shift the participant out of distraction and into perception. The herb, in this context, wasn't casual. It was consecrated. It did not scatter the mind. It focused it. Modern culture, with its jokes and its haze, has inherited only a shadow of this legacy. But when we look back at how the ancients approached the plant with reverence, discipline, and intention, we begin to understand what has been lost. Cannabis was never meant to be an escape from reality. In the temples of Egypt, it was a bridge into deeper reality, a path toward the inner eye that sees not just the world around us, but the truth that lies behind it. If cannabis was the sacred key, breath was the lock it was meant to turn. The ancients understood that one without the other was incomplete. They believed the plant alone could open a door, but without preparation, that door might lead to confusion rather than clarity. The forgotten half of the ritual was the breath, intentional, rhythmic, deliberate, used to guide energy through the body, like a current. Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom and hidden knowledge, was said to teach initiates not only how to use the green smoke, but how to breathe with it. This practice became known as the seven-breath activation. The number wasn't chosen at random. Across traditions, 7 has always symbolized completion. The 7 chakras of the human body, the 7 heavens, the 7 stages of alchemical transformation. To breathe 7 times in a sacred pattern was to align yourself with the structure of the cosmos itself. The pattern was simple, but its effect profound. Inhale deeply through the nose, allowing the breath to cool and expand the body. Hold, just long enough to notice the stillness between beginning and end. Exhale slowly through the mouth, as if fog rolling off a mountain. Repeat 7 times. By the 7th, the body begins to settle, the nervous system shifts, and the mind quiets into a space most people never touch in the chaos of daily life. It was only after this preparation that the priests introduced cannabis, one slow draw, not rushed or greedy, but measured and intentional, held lightly, then released. In this state, the smoke did not scatter thoughts, it cleared them. What followed was not entertainment, but awakening the subtle sense that behind every ordinary moment lies something more, waiting to be seen. Modern seekers often forget this discipline. They approach cannabis casually, phone in hand, noise in the background, mind restless. But the ancients remind us, the plant responds to the energy you bring. Enter with haste, and you invite haze. Enter with stillness, and you invite revelation. The 7-breath activation was not just technique, it was a statement, a vow of presence. It told the body, this moment is sacred. It told the mind, to be still enough to listen. And it told the spirit, you are ready to receive. Combined with the green messenger, breath became the other half of the key, unlocking not intoxication, but alignment. Alignment with yourself, with the world, and with the currents that move quietly beneath both. To use cannabis for higher consciousness is not about what strain you smoke or how much you consume. It is about the way you enter the ritual, the way you breathe, the way you prepare your inner temple. Thoth's forgotten breath is a reminder that awakening doesn't arrive in a rush. It arrives in rhythm N, 7 quiet steps toward clarity. Every culture that has ever worked with altered states has warned of the same threshold, the moment when the darkness comes. In modern language, we call it a bad trip. The laughter fades, the music twists, and suddenly the air feels heavy, strange. Colors shift into menace, shadows stretch, and somewhere deep inside, fear takes hold. Most people try to escape that moment, to push it away, to call it a mistake. But the ancients would have said, this is the point. In Tibetan texts, there is the bardo, the realm between death and rebirth, where the soul is forced to confront visions shaped by its own fears and attachments. In the Amazon, shamans describe ayahuasca journeys, where the spirits that appear are not foreign beings at all, but reflections of the unresolved wounds inside the seeker. And within Egyptian mystery schools, initiates were taught that the so-called demon you meet is not an enemy, but a part of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. Cannabis, when used with reverence, can open a gentler version of this same door. It does not fling you into chaos the way stronger psychedelics might. It invites you to sit with what you've hidden. The mirror it holds up does not distort, it clarifies. That is why one person may find bliss in the smoke, while another is gripped by anxiety. The plant itself does not change. It amplifies what is already within you. The demon, and then, is not there to torment. It is there to be acknowledged. To look at the shadow with stillness is to reclaim it, to integrate what has been disowned. Fear, when examined, loses its teeth. It shifts into insight. The panic that once made your heart race begins to dissolve into understanding. This is the wound you carry. This is the truth you've buried. This is the weight you've been dragging behind you. That is why ancient traditions prepared so carefully before ritual. They fasted, prayed, purified their bodies, not because they were superstitious, but because they knew the plant would surface whatever was unresolved. To step into the smoke without intention was to risk being overwhelmed, but to step in with readiness was to transform fear into a doorway. Modern seekers, too, can learn from this. If you feel the shadows rising when you partake, do not run. Ask the fear what it wants to show you. Listen, not with panic, but with curiosity. You may find that what terrified you is simply a fragment of your own story asking to be healed. In that way, the bad trip is not a failure of the ritual. Tea is the ritual. To use cannabis as a method of spiritual awakening is to accept that clarity doesn't always come in light. Sometimes it comes dressed as darkness, waiting for you to see through it. The mirror does not lie. It reflects the wholeness of who you are, both shadow and soul. And if you are willing to face that reflection, what once felt like terror can become liberation. The lesson of fear is not paralysis, it is freedom. Close your eyes and think back to the last time you used cannabis. What sounds were around you? Was it the laughter of friends, the hum of traffic, or maybe a playlist running in the background. Most people don't realize that the soundscape they step into while under the influence doesn't just shape the mood, tea sculpts the entire experience. For the ancients, this wasn't an accident, it was a science, one that blurred the line between spirituality and technology. In Egypt, priests knew that vibration could do more than stir emotion. They designed their temples to resonate like instruments, their chants echoing across stone chambers until the very air pulsed with rhythm. These weren't songs for entertainment, they were codes, carefully intoned to vibrate within the skull, to stimulate the vagus nerve, to guide the nervous system into states of calm and openness. Modern neuroscience now calls this process entrainment. Slow, steady tones can nudge the brain from busy beta waves into the slower, dreamlike states of alpha and theta. And when cannabis is added to the equation, that shift doesn't just happen faster, tea goes deeper. Imagine a deep drone at 432 Hz, or a steady hum at 528. These frequencies, revered in solfeggio scales and in sacred chants across traditions, line up with the natural rhythms of the body and the earth itself. Under cannabis, they don't simply sound pleasant, they tune you. The plant quiets the surface chatter, and the vibration slips through, aligning heartbeats, breath, and awareness until the whole body becomes an instrument, resonating in harmony. You can see the same echoes in Rastafarian traditions, often dismissed as stoner culture by outsiders. The drums, the call and response chants, the repeated names of the divine. These are not random, they are ritual structures passed down from African lineages, from Sufi zikas, from Vedic mantras. The repetition is not to numb the mind, but to anchor it, to create a frequency strong enough to carry consciousness into new terrain. Cannabis in this context becomes not the star of the show, but the companion, the amplifier that makes the vibration more vivid, the silence more profound. This is why sound, in sacred use, is not background decoration. It is navigation. The ancients would never have lit incense in silence or let random noise dictate the journey. They chose their tones, the way a traveler chooses a compass. Because when cannabis opens the door, what comes through is shaped by the vibration that fills the room. Chaos invites chaos. Harmony invites clarity. So the next time you consider how to use cannabis for healing, don't just ask about strain or dosage. Ask about sound. What frequencies will you let into that space? Gregorian chants, throat, singing, solfeggio tones pulsing at 432 Hz. These are not just options, they are tools. Tools that can stabilize the mind, open the body, and turn the high into something far more than a fleeting escape. To activate healing vibration is to understand that your body is already a resonant chamber, and cannabis simply makes it more sensitive, more responsive. The question isn't whether it will shape your state. The question is, what kind of state will you choose to invite? There is a truth about cannabis that most people never stop to consider. The plant does not create your state, it amplifies it. Whatever you bring to it, your mood, your fears, your distractions, that is what it magnifies. When approached without intention, cannabis doesn't heal, it distorts. That's why so many modern users describe paranoia, apathy, or emotional fog. It isn't that the plant is broken or malicious, it's that it mirrors back what's already inside, without the preparation needed to hold it. Treat it casually, and it becomes casual in return. Light up with restless energy, and you'll find the restlessness multiplied. Approach it with unresolved pain, and you may feel that pain intensify. For some, this cycle spirals into dependence or avoidance, using the herb not as a tool for growth, but as an escape hatch from feelings they don't want to face. The ancients knew better. They did not step into the ritual without cleansing first. Fasting was not superstition. Tea was a way of clearing the body, so the energy would flow freely. Bathing wasn't just hygiene. Tea was purification, a signal to the mind that something sacred was about to begin. Prayer or meditation steadied the spirit, so that when the smoke entered, it had a vessel strong enough to hold the visions it revealed. These practices weren't about morality, they were about readiness. Think of the difference between a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon and the same blade in the hands of a child. The tool is the same, but the outcome depends entirely on preparation, discipline, and respect. Cannabis is no different. When treated as a toy, it scatters and numbs. When treated as a teacher, it sharpens and heals. This is why the phrase, sacred cannabis healing ritual, carries such weight. It is not about ceremony for ceremony's sake. It is about building a container strong enough to hold what the plant reveals. Without that structure, the experience spills over, become nuaz, loses, meaning within that container it becomes guidance, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, but always instructive. So the next time you reach for cannabis, pause, ask yourself not how much, but why. Are you chasing escape or seeking insight? Are you running from the truth or preparing to meet it? The plant will not judge, but it will respond. And the way it responds depends entirely on the energy you bring. When people hear the phrase war on drugs, they imagine a campaign to protect society from dangerous substances. But behind closed doors, in the corridors of power, another story was unfolding. One that reveals just how much truth was hidden from the public. During the Cold War, the United States government, desperate to gain an edge in psychic research, launched a series of classified programs under the umbrella known as Project Stargate. Most know of the experiments with LSD or sensory deprivation, but few realize that cannabis itself was quietly tested on subjects in secret laboratories. The dosages weren't the casual joints of teenagers in back alleys. They were low, measured, and deliberate. Participants were placed in controlled environments, their breathing observed, their minds directed towards specific tasks, and what happened shook the assumptions of the very agencies running the trials. Under cannabis, subjects began to describe distant locations they had never visited. They drew sketches of military facilities, later matched by reconnaissance photographs. They spoke of underground structures that intelligence confirmed only afterward. These weren't hallucinations that faded with the high. They were verifiable perceptions that suggested consciousness could extend far beyond the limits of the five senses. Why haven't you heard this? Because cannabis worked too well. Unlike stronger psychedelics, it didn't shatter the ego beyond repair. It left participants tethered to their bodies, able to function, while extending awareness outward like a kite on a string. For the intelligence community, that made it a double-edged sword, a tool of perception too powerful to ignore, but too destabilizing to ever release into public hands. If ordinary citizens could access states of awareness that slipped through propaganda, through fear, through the stories spun to keep them obedient, what would happen to control? So the findings were buried, reports were redacted, studies shelved, and cannabis was pushed further into the realm of criminality. The narrative was flipped. What had proven to heighten awareness was recast as a drug that dulled it. The same plant that in a lab enabled remote viewing was on the streets portrayed as a gateway to apathy. The contradiction is staggering, but only if you believe the official story was ever about the plant. In truth, the war on drugs was never a war on substances. It was a war on perception. It was about restricting the tools that awaken awareness while promoting the ones that sedate it. Alcohol remained legal, celebrated even, despite its role in violence and disease. Tobacco, too, was left untouched, despite killing millions, but cannabis, cheap, abundant, and capable of expanding consciousness, was crushed under stigma. And yet, like every suppressed truth, it refuses to stay buried. The rituals of Thoth, the ancient uses encoded in temples and scriptures, echo today in whispers and rediscovered practices. The same qualities that made governments fear the plant are the ones that make seekers turn back to it now. Its ability to thin the veil, to tune awareness, to reveal what lies beneath the noise. That is the forbidden secret. Cannabis was not hidden because it made people lazy. It was hidden because it helped them see. And a society that sees too clearly is the last thing the architects of control can afford. Long before it was criminalized, long before it was reduced to a punchline or a taboo, cannabis was spoken of in reverent tones across cultures that had no contact with one another. In India's Vedas, some of the oldest spiritual texts on earth, it was Vijaya, the conqueror of suffering, one of the 5 sacred plants gifted to humanity. It was mixed into drinks, not for pleasure, but to dissolve the walls of ego and open the self to union with the divine. In Egypt, priests burned it with blue lotus and resins in rituals meant to awaken vision, believing the smoke itself carried prayers into the hidden realm of the gods. And in the Hebrew Bible, scholars now see the mysterious ingredient cannabis in the holy anointing oil as cannabis applied to prophets and priests to prepare them for communion with the sacred. Across these traditions, the plant was not just tolerated, it was indispensable, a bridge between the human mind and the vastness beyond it. What happened to that legacy? Colonization and empire, institutions that sought to centralize power, rewrote stories, erased symbols, and branded once honored practices as primitive or sinful. The church reframed sacred plants as tools of the devil. Governments rewrote them into crimes. Corporations found no profit in a medicine that grows abundantly in any soil. Bit by bit, cannabis was stripped of its role as sacrament and recast as a threat. And yet, the thread of memory never fully died. Folk healers still brewed teas and tinctures in secret. Communities carried chants and rituals underground, where meaning was preserved, even if names were changed. The Rastafarians, often mocked as mere stoners, carried forward the heartbeat of Africa, blending drums in scripture and smoke into ceremonies that echoed much older truths. Their chants were not rebellion for rebellion's sake. They were continuity, an inheritance of wisdom that refused to be silenced. This is why cannabis continues to resurface in every generation. It is not just a plant to get high from. It is a global sacrament, an esoteric tool that transcends borders, a bridge that connects hemispheres of the brain and dimensions of reality. To sit with it consciously is to take part in a lineage older than nations, older than dogma. A lineage that reminds us that awakening is not the property of a chosen few, but the birthright of all. The forgotten sacrament still waits in plain sight. What was once denied, mocked, and erased can be remembered, not as nostalgia, but as a living practice. And when we choose to honor cannabis not as an escape, but as a guide, we step back into that lineage, rejoining a circle of seekers stretching across time, all listening for the same whisper: see more clearly, and remember who you are. At the end of this journey, one truth stands clear. Cannabis was never meant to be just smoke in the air or laughter in the dark. It was meant to be part of a ritual, a weaving together of breath, sound, intention, and the question you dare to ask yourself. When approached with reverence, it does not blur reality. Tea sharpens it. It does not carry you away. Eye brings you back to what was always within reach. This plant was never only about getting high, it was about remembering. Remembering that clarity is possible, that silence has depth, that the veil can be lifted if you are willing to meet it with stillness. The ancients left us hints, the chants, the oils, the breath, all of it pointed to one simple truth. Awakening is not a gift handed down from above. It is a choice. The key is not lost. It is already in your hands. What you do with it depends on the energy you bring. Treat the plant as a toy, and it will reflect your haste. Treat it as a teacher, and it will guide you into yourself. The hidden truth the world tried so hard to bury is waiting for you to reclaim it, not from books, not from systems, but from within. So when you step into the ritual, step with intention. Let your breath steady you. Let sound anchor you. Let the question open you. And when the smoke clears, walk away, not simply altered, but awakened